Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm sorry things didn't work out with the lecture tonight. I apologize for that. We did, I don't know how much you got, but we have a term paper assignment. The term paper assignment is on the front page of the Blackboard site, and so you can read it there. But read it over, and then if you have any questions, you can send me an email. Got until Wednesday of finals week to do that. Well, I'm going to start over because obviously I don't know how much you got and how much you didn't of that. So I'm going to do the art stuff and then maybe we'll have a longer lecture next time a little bit. But what we're going to talk about today was why does it keep doing that? Production of art. Oh, yeah, and I put a little picture of Rosie here to make it a little more visually interesting on the screen. So I'll try and put a picture of Rosie up. She's nice to look at. Okay, production of art. So, first question is, why produce art? And I hope nobody was complaining, so I hope most of you heard this. But what I talked about was these bowerbirds in Australia that build these huge nests that are like 9 feet tall. And some of you correctly inferred that, yeah, the reason that they do this is it's a sexually selected characteristic that they use to attract mates. And so that leads to, and I went over that a lot more when I actually did it online, but now I think you heard that part. Miller 2000, his theory is producing art. Stop it, please. Is a sexually selected capacity of humans that males use to attract mates. That is, just like for the bowerbirds, humans do the same thing. And so that is the purpose of art, according to Miller. And so let's talk about then the predictions from this theory. I'm presuming, just because I didn't get any complaints until this point, that most of the earlier stuff got through, so I'm not repeating that stuff. Now I think this is the part where people had problems, okay? So I'm going to go slower, and you might rehear some things you've already heard. So one prediction that he doesn't really assess in his book at all is that males cross culturally should produce more art than females. Well, certainly in Western culture, this appears to be true. This prediction follows from the idea that art is a sexually selected characteristic, and so males should have evolved to display the characteristic, and females should have evolved to appreciate the characteristics. So just like it's the male bowerbirds that produce the big nests, we would expect the male humans to be the ones producing art. Well, certainly in Western culture, most of the art produced that you find in galleries, and certainly most of the musical compositions, those appear to be produced by men. Now, we can't know how that might be in other cultures. I don't think there's ever been a cross-cultural assessment of how much art is produced by each sex. So we don't know for sure, but one example I gave was male music composers. Kyle knew of one female music composer, but that's about the only one anybody can come up with. And so male music composers tend to have very strange brains, where they have really good right hemisphere that they use for creating the music. So music is a right hemisphere function. And then, though, they have to have a really good left hemisphere, because what you need to do to write down that music is you're essentially using the language areas, the sequencing areas in the left hemisphere in order to actually compose the music. And so if you look at the brains of music composers, they tend to have really thick callosal connections between the hemispheres, a lot of interhemispheric talk, and you have to have a really strong both right and left hemisphere in order to be a music composer. And so I think, well, you have to have a very, very strange brain in order to compose music, and 99% of all people who have that brain in the world are males. Now, there is a problem for the theory, and the problem is the theory fails to explain why females would ever produce art. Art may be sexually slash friendly selected for females as well. Yeah. So what I mean is, in the male bowerbirds, it's only the males that produce the art, and so that was what we'd expect generally of displays designed to attract females. The term lekking comes from the lek that the prairie chicken uses to do a dance for the females. And then you're probably aware a lot of male displays, combat displays, like deers and rams fighting with one another. Only males do that. And so for sexually selected characteristics in the animal kingdom, only males do them. But both males and females would produce art. And so, females, particularly singers, maybe the best paid singers, are female. I don't know. It's pretty close. So certainly a lot of female musicians are very good. A lot of female painters are very good. And so certainly females do produce art, maybe not to the extent that males do. And so that might be because it's good to show off, artistic ability is good to show off for anybody. Might help the female to attract mates, but also to attract friends, because the same sort of characteristics like discipline and intelligence, having a good brain that help you to produce good art would help you in friendly situations as well. So that may explain that. Okay, so that was the first one. Second one, predictions from the theory. Females should value artistic ability in potential mates more than do males. Females should value artistic ability in potential mates more than do males. So remember, we talked about the Buss studies on mate preference, and he had people rate from 0 to 3 how important different characteristics would be. So we found that females, for example, like males with good financial prospects and good high social status. Well, one thing he did not ask in those is how attractive would it be for a mate to have good artistic ability. And the clear prediction from the theory is females should care more about that than males do. Now, I think just anecdotally this appears to be true. I don't know if anybody's ever tested it. As far as I know, they haven't. But every group of guys I knew who were in high school and wanted to start a rock band, or every guy I knew who wanted to learn to play the guitar, it was because they thought it would help them to get females. And similarly, lots of the world's great visual artists have had lots of mistresses. Picasso was famous for the number of mistresses he had. Gauguin lived in French Polynesia, Tahiti, for many years, and he was the one who introduced venereal disease to Tahiti, introduced syphilis there. And then Modigliani was famous for portrait painting of women in particular, and his requirement was that they have sex with him before he would paint them. And so there appears to be the case that artists are very attractive to females. I don't think it goes the other way. I don't think a female has a lot of artistic ability that makes her more attractive as a mate for males. That's just my guess, just based on the anecdotal evidence of my life, but I guess I don't know for sure. So that would be another prediction. It seems like it would come out, but I guess we don't know for certain. All right, third. This is where we started to get into our problems, and so now I'll expand more on these points. So, all right, third prediction from the theory is that people should like art that indicates the fitness of the producer. Okay. And what I mean by that is art that is difficult to produce. So this is one of these times when it was cutting out a lot, and I don't know, some of you heard me and some of you didn't. But I asked people, when you see, like, the average person goes to an art museum, they see a Jackson Pollock painting where somebody's just randomly thrown paint on the screen. What is the average person likely to say when they see something like that? And Alex said, my kid could do that, yeah, or a chimpanzee could do that, a third grader could do that. That's certainly what I would say. And what I said before, and I don't know if you heard me, I guess I was castigated by my fourth grade teacher once when she overheard me saying something like that. And she told me, no, you shouldn't worry about how difficult it is to produce this particular piece of art. What you should worry about is whether it's pretty or not, whether it's nice to look at or causes some sort of emotion in you. That's how you evaluate art, not on whether it's hard to produce. Well, I still feel that way. I guess I'm still a Philistine. I really, really am not impressed when somebody does a piece of art that would be easy to produce, and I think most people feel that way. The theory as such, that's really big. I'm going to change the font. 32. Okay. So the theory thus provides an explanation for why tastes in art change and are different across cultures. Whatever is difficult to produce at a particular time and culture is what is deemed aesthetically pleasing. Theory provides an explanation why tastes in art change and are different across cultures. Whatever is difficult to produce at a particular time and culture is what is deemed aesthetically pleasing. So if something makes it more difficult to produce a particular piece of art, then people are going to like it better. That's a clear prediction from the theory. And there are numerous examples of this phenomenon, so let's talk about them. Examples, saturated colors were considered more beautiful in ancient times than they are now. Okay, a saturated color is one without a lot of white in it that's not washed out, so bold, vibrant colors like vibrant red or vibrant yellow, that's what we're talking about. And the reason why it was so rare to find vibrant colors in ancient, when I mean ancient times, I mean ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Why that was so difficult is that the dyes necessary for those colors came from either India or China. And so to make them all the way to Greece and Italy, of course, that was very, very expensive. And so it was only the very richest people who could afford to have saturated colors. And so that was saturated colors in clothing as well as in art were considered more beautiful at that time. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia and invaded the Persian treasury, the single most valuable item in the Persian treasury was a purple robe that was worth 4 times its weight in gold. You probably get this robe for $20 at Walmart today, but at the time, purple was so difficult to get, the dyes were, that it was considered extremely beautiful. Now, second example I want to give of a case where taste and art change is silversmithing. Silversmithing, that is how you say it, has gone from valuing smooth, symmetrical utensils to valuing asymmetrical utensils with irregular finishes. So silversmithing has gone from valuing smooth symmetrical utensils to valuing asymmetrical utensils with irregular finishes. Okay, so let's take like somebody from Paul Revere's time. Paul Revere was a silversmith, and he would carve the molds that he used to make this silverware by hand. And so if you're carving the mold by hand, of course, it's very hard to make the resulting silver piece symmetrical, and it's also hard to make it have a smooth finish. It's going to likely have a rough finish unless you're a really, really, really good silversmith. So in the old days when people made molds by hand, if you had the smoother the silver piece was, the fewer flaws on it, the more valuable it was, the more beautiful it was considered. Well, now that is not the case. Now it's really easy to get perfectly smooth and perfectly symmetrical utensils. Again, you could probably go to Walmart and for $6 get an entire set of perfectly smooth, perfectly symmetrical utensils. And so now if somebody's going to a silversmith to get their knives and forks, they want them to look like it has been smithed. That is, they don't want it to be symmetrical and smooth because otherwise it will look like it had been done by the machine. They want people to know they spent the big bucks to get the personally silversmithed utensils. And I saw this, one of the psychonomics was held in Seattle, and I went to the Seattle Art Museum when I was there, and they showed the same thing. They had a silversmithing exposition where they showed silver pieces really from about the 16th century on. And you can see the early ones, they were beautiful. They were so smooth, but they're super, super shiny. They'd been polished to a super shine, and they just looked perfectly smooth and symmetrical. The ones from the 20th century were crazy. They looked like they'd been knocked down the stairs, and so they were very asymmetrical, tended to have dents and weird things in them. And so you can even see it from professional artists. They've gone from valuing smooth silver to non-smooth silver. Now, I'll give you, before I put the last one in, this is the last instance of an explanation for why taste and art change. Think to yourself now, before I write this down, when is the first artistic movement that did paintings that weren't realistic? That is, they didn't really look like the item in the real world. And I think the answer is the Impressionists. The Impressionists starting around 1880s or so, Gauguin and Van Gogh and Monet and Manet and those guys. They made paintings that did not look like the real thing anymore. Now, the theory is that this was the result of photography. So as photography became more popular, realism within visual art decreased. So throughout all of human history, really, it was considered to be a mark of the artist's skill if they could make something as much like the real item as it really could. So you were striving for photographic quality in your paintings. But after photography, and so photography, probably the first event you associate with photography, for me anyway, is the Civil War. That's the first event where there are lots and lots of photographs taken of it. And so that became popular around 1860, 1870, and what do you know? By 1880, we've got this art movement that produces unrealistic type paintings. So any bozo with a camera could produce realism anymore. So in order to show off, now you had to make things unrealistic to show your skill. And so the skill went from being able to produce things photographically correct to things that weren't photographically correct. And so that explains it became easy to produce realistic drawings. That's why unrealistic drawings became more popular, because they indicated the fitness of the producer. Okay, so I found that kind of interesting, and those are points that Miller actually makes in his book. Okay, so now number 4, art would be expected to disproportionately represent sexual themes. Art would be expected to disproportionately represent sexual themes. That is, the purpose of art is to attract mates. One way to do that is to get the mate thinking about sex. And the question is, what do most songs that you would hear on the radio concern themselves with? And I think the answer has been always love. Romantic love is the main topic of those songs. Very rare that people write songs about cleaning up the garage or preparing their tax forms. Love appears to be the dominant theme. And when I was a little kid, this seemed strange to me. It seemed like a strange part of our culture. Why are all of these songs about love? Isn't there anything else to sing about? Well, it totally makes sense they'd all be about love if what you were doing is trying to attract a mate. And so we'd expect songs to be about love. We expect love to be a frequent theme in paintings and nudes in paintings. I've been told that nudes are featured in paintings because the human body is so beautiful. Well, yeah, that's right, but it also makes you think of sex, right? And so I think that's likely why sex is disproportionately represented in art. So there are, probably hundreds of thousands of songs about heterosexual love, I would say. But can you think of any songs about how much a sister loves her brother? Maybe you can. I had one undergraduate one day said they knew a song like that, but I can't. I know a lot of songs, and I don't know any about how much a sister loves her brother. And the reason is I think we would consider that to be kind of creepy. At some level we realize it's to attract a mate, so a sister singing about how much she loves her brother, that's kind of a creepy thing, and so we don't like it very much. Now, I have I don't want to call it a theory, but kind of a not very useful suggestion at this point. I've often speculated that maybe the reason we like music so much is because we descended from some animal that used a mating call at some point. I've always been surprised that people appear to enjoy music so much, specifically relative to, say, visual art. When I asked the undergrads in the class if you had a choice to go to an art museum or that had visual art that you liked, or a concert that had music that you liked, which one would you prefer? And they all choose the concert. Now, some of them will say, well, what about like movie? I'd rather go to the movie than either one. Well, that contains kind of a story element, and so I think that's maybe a little bit different. So I don't know if it's the visual aspect of the movie or the story aspect, I think, is maybe why people like that. Because if it was the visual aspect, then I'd expect them to be more interested in seeing visual art than they are. So that's my, again, not very useful idea about why people might like music, is maybe we descended from an animal that used a mating call, and that hardware is still up there for us to like that music. But like all theories, the theory has to be falsifiable to be useful, and I don't have a falsifier right now for my theory, so that's why I don't think it's a really a good theory. Okay, well, let's go on. I think I want to talk about evidence for his theory. It's not really a prediction his theory makes, but I would say the best... we're really at the bottom here. Let me move up. The best evidence of sexual selection in human art comes from the archaeological study of hand axes. Hand axes were made by Homo ergaster for over 1 million years. Hand axes were made by Homo ergaster for over 1 million years. Okay, if you remember the movie about Homo ergaster all the way back, they said that the Homo ergaster made these hand axes. And they said they don't even think about it. They just kind of make it like the bird builds the nest. They're just kind of genetically predisposed to make these hand axes. Let me show you some of the hand axes here. So here's some Homo erectus hand axes. And you can see some of them are better than others. This will look really good here, but that's a really crappy one here. They're not so good. And the interesting thing is, because they're made of stone, we have like an archaeological record over hundreds of thousands of years of these being made. So they made these. These were Homo ergaster, remember, was the one in Africa. When they went into Asia, we call them Homo erectus, and they didn't really make stone tools. They probably made bamboo tools. So these are the ones in Africa. But we can see that there was an evolution in the hand axes over time. So what you get is that from about 1.6 million years ago, that's when the earliest were, to about 200,000 years ago, which were the last hand axes, there is a clear change in the hand axes. First, they become more symmetrical over time. So here, these are very symmetrical, but like this one and this one and this one are terrible. They're not symmetrical at all. So you can see as we go through time, and I think that's what they've got here, the hand axes get sharper edges, they become thinner, and they become more symmetrical. Further, let's also say like most art, many hand axes are not very useful items, and they appear to change over time, getting smoother and more symmetrical. Okay, now, they were, of course, I said many hand axes are not very useful items. Well, they were useful. I mean, obviously they used them to cut meat, and they used them as tools for any time they needed some sort of cutting. But what I mean is, one of the interesting things is, as you look at the evolution of hand axes over the 1.4 million years that they were made, the ones really late tend to be like, it looks like somebody is showing off, that they're really making a hand axe not for use, but just to show that it could be made. So they found hand axes, and again, these are only the really late ones, that are so huge that they're impossible for a single person to pick up. And then they've also found some really delicate, dainty ones that would be very, very difficult to produce. So some of the hand axes appear to be produced just to show off how good a hand axe maker you are, rather than for actual use. And that's what we'd expect of a sexually selected characteristic. Further, just like the bowerbirds, remember the bowerbirds' nests got bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And the reason is, well, I didn't say that, but yeah, the bowerbirds' nests have gotten bigger over time. And the reason is that in every generation, it's going to be the bowerbirds that build the biggest nests that are going to be selected for. And so now in the next generation, you're going to have a higher concentration of the good bower building genes than you had in the previous generation. And every subsequent generation, that's just going to keep going. And so over time, the bowers are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, the idea is that if people are selecting their mates, a female, a Homo ergaster is selecting her mate on the basis of the ability to make hand axes, well, then the hand axes should get better and better and better over time, and they do. Turns out hand axes are really hard to make, and they probably do reveal something about the skill of the person who made them. Modern anthropologists who've tried to make hand axes themselves, it takes about 6 months to teach yourself how to make a good hand axe, and years to perfect that. There's a lot of risk of injury while making them. If you make them with your bare hand, as Homo ergaster almost certainly would have, you're almost certainly going to get cuts on your hand and flying shards. So That probably indicates that you got a good immune system because you're going to get cut a lot. And so you're going to have good hand-eye coordination, strength, planning, pain tolerance, and resistance to infection to make a good hand axe. It makes total sense that this was being sexually selected for over time. Okay, so that is the best evidence, the evidence that I know of that Miller's theory might be right, is that some of these things we just talked about. Well, now the other thing about art, and I won't spend too much time on this, let's talk about evolutionary explanations of human preferences in visual art. Evolutionary explanation of human preferences in visual art. So, why do we like some art better? I'm not doing that. Please stop that. Okay, why do we like some art better than others? And there have been a couple of hypotheses. One is there was this article by Ramachandran and Hirstein. This was in 2000. They call this caricature theory. Caricature theory. People like art that exaggerate. I'm sorry. Let me move this up. Ramachandran and Hirstein, 2000. Caricature theory. People like art that exaggerates the unique qualities of stimuli in the natural world. Caricature theory. People like art that exaggerates the unique qualities of stimuli in the natural world. Oh, okay. Let me explain what I mean by this. So we talked about some of these things when we were talking about beauty, for example. We talked about how females have bigger, rounder eyes than males do. But then when they're portrayed in like a Disney movie, or I don't know if you've seen like the Tiny Toons show, I don't know if that's around anymore, where they have like the Warner Brothers characters kind of in baby versions. Well, the interesting thing is that big eyes, so when they make the Disney characters, they make the eyes super big and round. And when they make the Tiny Toons babies, they have, just like real babies, they have huge heads relative to their body size. They have really big eyes, and so that's the big thing. Big eyes and heads relative to the body. And so the idea is that these things exaggerate the features that make these things unique, such that the Disney princesses just look hyper feminine. If you got a cell up in your head for what a female looks like, this is just going to drive that cell crazy because you've exaggerated all the aspects that make the female face different than the male face. And making the Tiny Toons look babyish, they're taking the neotenous features, the features of a baby, and exaggerating those. So babies have big heads relative to their bodies, big eyes relative to their heads. And so this really gives you if you got a cell that goes crazy when you see a young-looking person, that's going to drive that cell totally crazy when it sees the Tiny Toons characters. What they refer to this as, it's an example of what's called the peak shift effect. And this is an effect shown in animal learning, where if you teach the rats to press a button for, let's say they press this button, they flash something on a screen, it can be a rectangle or a square. And if they press the button for the rectangle, they get a food reward. If they press it for the square, they get shocked, let's say. Well, so you train them on that, and then what you do is you change the rectangle to make it more extreme, less like a square. So one side was just a little bit longer than the other when they learned it, but now one side is way longer than the other when they do the experiment the second time. Well, what they find is that the rats press the bar more vigorously to the new rectangle that they haven't seen before than the old one, even though they've been rewarded for the old one? Well, the idea is that the new one will activate square even less than the old one did. So it's very, very clear that this is a rectangle, and so that's why they go crazy. It activates like the rectangle cell up in their head better than the original rectangle that they were trained on. And so the idea is that there can be, something can look more like a stimulus than the stimulus itself if you exaggerate the unique aspects. Most popular example in literature is this article by Sue Brennan. And I don't know, I'm not a big fan of this article, but let me describe what she did. So what she did is she got people in the psychology department where she was working. So these were professors in the department that were known to everybody. And essentially made line drawings of their faces. There were a few unique points that she had identified in everybody's face. She would put points on a photograph and then connect the points to make a picture of the person. And honestly, I think she had like about 200 points or something like that. They looked very cartoonish. They didn't look a lot like a real person. But then what she did was, so she has line drawings of all these people. And she also had, I think, the average from all of them, what the average position of each of her little points was that she was marking to make these line drawings. And what she would do is she'd find the parts of the face that showed the biggest deviations from average for each person. So if somebody had like really large eyes relative to average, she would note that. And then what she would do is she'd take the difference between what that person had for, let's say, the location of one of their eyes, and then the average location, and then multiply it by 50%. So she's greatly, the things that were a little bit exaggerated or a little bit different than the average person and this person, now they're way exaggerated. So the person had a little bit bigger nose than most people. Now they have a much bigger nose. And the more they deviated, of course, the more adding 50% on to the change is gonna alter it. So these are now caricatured faces where the parts of the face that deviate most from the average face have been exaggerated. And when she had people in the psych department who knew all these people try to identify the real picture that actually had the lines in the correct location for the person's face, as opposed to the caricatured picture that exaggerated the difference from their face and the average, people actually found it easier to identify the exaggerated faces. Now, I'm not sure how much this actually engaged regular face recognition processes, because they measured how long it took them to recognize these people with a stopwatch. So that tells me it's taking on the order of several seconds for them to identify them, and that's certainly not going to be true, of course, of normal face recognition. But still, that is interesting. That's essentially what caricatures are. You take the most exaggerated aspects of somebody's face and then exaggerate them more. Okay, so that is one theory for why people like art. People like art because art allows you to produce things that are kind of more like a thing than the thing itself. So exaggerating the aspects that distinguish that thing from other things, and apparently that's something we like. All right, let's talk about Pinker's theory. Pinker, 2001... This is the Savannah hypothesis, which I think we talked about a different Savannah hypothesis in conjunction with happiness. But this Savannah hypothesis is that people prefer landscapes that include features that would have made them good places to live in the EEA. And remember, the EEA is the environment of evolutionary adaptation. So if you ask people what sort of landscapes they like, people rarely say they want to see deserts or forests. And I think we talked about some of this when we were actually talking about the Savannah hypothesis, that essentially as you age, you become more interested in being on a savanna. So when you ask people to typically want what they like in landscapes, they say they want lots of lush vegetation. They want small groups of trees. They like a source of fresh water, so people prefer rivers and lakes in landscapes to oceans, for example. They want lots of blue and green. They would like to have animals present, and people like to have women and children present more so than men. And this all makes sense. So you care about having a fresh water source if you're looking for a good place to live. Want a lot of lush vegetation. That means there'll be lots of plants to gather. You'd like, if there is women and children around, well, they aren't being threatened. That indicates it's probably a safe place. And if there are animals around, that indicates it would be good for hunting. So it totally makes sense that people would like those elements in a landscape. And they've replicated this cross-culturally. It's been done in Asia, African, and a variety of European cultures, and they all find the same thing. People want fresh water supply, lush vegetation, women and children and animals in the pictures that they like. Okay, well, the recording's a little bit short because I went really fast through the beginning stuff that I think you already heard. And then I destroyed part of my lecture this afternoon. I'm going to try and reconstitute it. This is a lecture on violence. We're going to talk about violence next time, so I'll push the violence lecture to next time. So that's it for this time, and then I'm going to post this video, and then I'll also give you an announcement when Kristen's email is posted. So we'll see you next week.